The automotive company Motus confirming its headline earnings up by 19% in the 6 months to the end of December helps that we're buying a lot more cars. Ockert Janse van Rensburg is the Group Chief Executive Officer at Motus. Ockert, good evening. The number of passenger cars sold in that period was up by, nearly 20%? I mean, clearly you're benefiting from all of that.
Good evening, Stephen, and thank you very much for having us. Yes, you're 100% right. You know, when the momentum is there, you better make sure you take advantage of it as well. And I think the momentum was already there at the end of our previous financial year ending June, but it certainly continued into this first half. And we've been able to, really translate it through some strategic focus and operational discipline into really good numbers, as you have seen. Headline earnings you called out, but I suppose also the other pleasing one for us is that we've also been able to generate large amounts of cash and been able to reduce our debt considerably. So all in all, a really good number for us.
You point out that people are moving away from luxury cars, and I realize price has been a factor, but it's always been a factor. Has something else maybe changed in the industry that luxury cars just aren't the kind of bling they used to be?
Yeah, I think a lot of it had to do with affordability. Over the number of years, I suppose these vehicles have become quite expensive. And unfortunately, I think as South African consumers, we struggle to, keep in touch with those. But luckily for the consumer side, what has happened is we have had a number of new entrants entering this market in the last 2 years. They've certainly helped to keep pricing at a reasonable level, as you have had hardly any price increases on vehicles pricing. So the OEMs had to chip in a little bit to make sure that they remain price competitive. And at the same time, we've had interest rates coming down, and I suppose from a consumer perspective, you are selling to the employed who probably had salary increases for the last 2 years. So it's all in all actually just been a good place for a consumer who was looking for a vehicle. We have seen more activity at the entry level, but I suppose you still see sales all the way through to even luxury brands today.
Other people in your space, some of them competitors, I suppose, Ockert, they've pointed out that they've benefited from investing in cheaper Indian and Chinese brands quite early. We know you were a little late to that party. Do you think you're catching up to the party? Are you where you want to be as our market shifts towards those cars?
Yes, I think sometimes it's also being a bit more selective what you want. I think in our case, we moved into that space only about 18 months or 2 years ago. I think we caught up very fast, and I mean, being the biggest group in the country, you also have maybe an unfair advantage when you do then eventually talk to these OEMs who've the new entrants. I suppose with volume aspirations, they also want to partner with us. So we've certainly made very large inroads into that space, and where we stand today, I think there's a fair chunk, and we represent all the major brands, whether they're Chinese, Indian, or otherwise. And but we're not leaving, our other mature brands still behind. I think, like we said, they still the guys who really give you the big numbers when it comes to operating profits, so the likes of Toyota, Hyundai, Kia. Those are really our stalwarts even in these 6 months.
Okay, you declared an interim dividend, and obviously I think you'd be right to be pleased with how things have turned out in this period. But you've also done all of this while retrenching some workers. You've also changed the payment systems for others. We saw the protest from workers about that. You've been negotiating with the union, I understand. They, I imagine, would feel quite frustrated to see an interim dividend from you while some of them have been retrenched.
I think you have to put it in perspective and also just look in what particular area of the business that was relating to. So that was only relating to a small part of our retail footprint, mainly to do with our brands such as VW, Nissan, to some extent Ford and maybe Mercedes. While obviously the profit generation comes from a much larger group that's internationally represented. You talk about the retrenchments. Yes, we did retrench 67 individuals, which is unfortunate, but there was also a particular reason for that, and that is that those brands are currently loss-making while the group is performing as well as it is. So it's also a question of having to cut your cloth accordingly to what is selling in the market, and unfortunately they were represented in a brand that's really been shrinking. However, I think it is important to note that the overall group represents 20,000 people over 4 continents, and really the rest of the business have performed exceptionally well. And yes, you have to, at certain times and place, actually do have to look at some businesses that require more focus. In our presentation today, we highlighted 3 of those, one being exactly what you were talking, those shrinking brands in the South African space. Even though the overall retail SA business increased by 22%, there was an area there where that's actually loss-making, and the losses increased by 29%. So there is an area of the business that do need focus, and we need to get the cost-to-income ratio right in that specific area, while it's not necessarily true for the whole business as a whole.
So is the retrenchment process over for the moment?
Yes, no, the retrenchment process was in fact already done in January. The other piece that I think you even had on your show was around the fact that we said on the incentive side, nothing to do with salaries, but the incentives, we also needed to look at that. For the support staff who were also receiving incentives, and we said on that particular case we needed to look at those structurings. That process we have, in fact, as we stand today, not actually implemented in its full extent. We have issued the letters, and the staff has in fact signed them, I think 4 individuals. So as we stand, that process is in fact completed, but we haven't implemented it to its full extent yet. But we are in talks with our staff in that particular regard, and not necessarily, I think, that the union any longer. The union, in fact, that particular court case, they actually did lose. So we didn't have to talk to them anymore, and we're actually talking to our staff. But listen, we're also working with our staff to also make sure that we find, alternatives that also works in the long term. This is all about the long-term sustainability of a business. And like I said, if there's a particular small area of the business that requires attention, of course we need to look at that. But it's also protecting the jobs for the other 20,000 people that are still working for us.
Ockert Janse van Rensburg, thank you. The Chief Executive Officer at Motus, just gone 7 o'clock.